In less than 3 months after hiking the price of bread, bakers under the aegis of Premium Bread Makers Association of Nigeria say they will increase the price of bread again.
You can walk into almost any grocery store in America right now and buy a loaf of white bread for less than $2, sometimes less than $1. That same loaf contains over 20 ingredients, was baked in a factory hundreds of miles away, shipped on a refrigerated truck, and will somehow stay soft on your shelf for 2 weeks. Meanwhile, the bakery down the street is charging you $6, $7, $8 for a loaf made with 4 ingredients: flour, water, salt, yeast. That's it. So how is it possible that the more complicated product, the one with the longer ingredient list, the bigger supply chain, and the nationwide distribution network is the cheaper one? The answer involves a century of government subsidies, a secret baking method invented in a small English village, and an industry that figured out how to turn air and water into profit. Let's get into it. To understand why white bread is so cheap, you have to start with the wheat. And to understand the wheat, you have to go back to 1933, right in the middle of the Great Depression. Farms were collapsing. Crop prices had cratered after World War I. A quarter of the American population worked in agriculture, and most of them were broke. So Congress passed the first Farm Bill. The idea was simple. The government would pay farmers to grow specific crops, things like wheat, corn, cotton, and rice. To stabilize prices and keep food on the table, it was supposed to be temporary. A lifeline during a crisis. That was over 90 years ago. The Farm Bill is still here, Congress renews it roughly every 5 years, and the subsidies have only gotten bigger. Since 1995, wheat alone has received over $48 billion in federal subsidies. Corn has gotten over $116 billion. And those are just the direct payments. When you factor in crop insurance, where the government covers around 62% of farmers' insurance premiums, the true cost of propping up these crops is staggering. But here's the thing most people don't realize. These subsidies don't go to small family farms growing tomatoes or strawberries. Fruits and vegetables barely receive any federal support at all. The money overwhelmingly flows to the biggest operations growing corn, soy, wheat, cotton, and rice, the exact crops that end up in processed food. So when you pick up a loaf of white bread and it costs $1.50, you're not seeing the real price. You already paid part of it through your taxes. The wheat in that loaf was grown on subsidized land, with subsidized insurance, by farmers who receive government payments when market prices drop below a certain floor. The raw ingredient was artificially cheap before it even left the farm. But cheap wheat alone doesn't explain a dollar loaf of bread. Plenty of foods use cheap ingredients and still cost more. The real breakthrough, the thing that truly made white bread absurdly affordable, happened in a small village in England called Chorleywood. In 1961, scientists at the British Baking Industries Research Association figured out something that would change the bread industry forever. Traditional bread takes time. You mix the dough, let it ferment for hours, sometimes overnight, then shape it, let it rise again, and bake it. The whole process could take 8 to 20 hours. That's a lot of labor, a lot of space for the fermenting dough, and a lot of time where things can go wrong. The Chorleywood bread process threw all of that out the window. Instead of slow fermentation, the dough gets blasted in a high-speed mixer for about 3 minutes. The mechanical energy does in moments what hours of natural fermentation used to do. The catch? You need to add a cocktail of extras to make it work. More yeast, 2 to 3 times the normal amount, emulsifiers to hold everything together, chemical oxidizing agents like ascorbic acid, hard fats, and a lot more water than traditional recipes call for. That last part is important. Nearly half the weight of an industrial white loaf is water. So when you're paying for a loaf of bread, you're partly paying for water that's been chemically bonded into the dough using emulsifiers and additives. The extra water also makes the bread softer and increases the yield from each batch of flour, which means more loaves per bag of wheat. The result? A factory can go from raw flour to sliced, bagged bread in under 4 hours. The process was so efficient that within a decade of its invention, it became the standard method for commercial bread production. Today it accounts for around 80% of bread made in the UK, and variations of it are used in factories around the world, including across the United States. And this is where it gets interesting. The Chorleywood process was originally developed to let bakeries use lower protein domestic wheat instead of expensive imported grain. That means factories don't need premium flour. They can use cheaper, weaker wheat and compensate with additives and mechanical force. So the wheat is cheaper, the process is faster, and the output is higher. Every single variable got optimized for cost. Now let's talk about what's actually inside that loaf, because a traditional bread recipe has 4 ingredients: flour, water, yeast, salt. A typical supermarket white loaf. Pick one up and read the label sometime. You'll find a list that can stretch to 20 or 30 items. There's the flour, which by law has to be enriched with vitamins because the refining process stripped them out in the first place. Ironic. They remove the nutritious parts of the grain, then add synthetic versions back in. Then there are the dough conditioners, things like datem, calcium stearoyl lactylate, and sometimes azodicarbonamide, the same chemical compound found in yoga mats and shoe soles. There are emulsifiers to keep the fats and water from separating, preservatives like calcium propionate to prevent mold, soy flour to speed up dough development and bleach the crumb whiter, cheap vegetable oils to soften the texture, because they're far cheaper than butter and don't need refrigeration. Added sugars, sometimes high fructose corn syrup, another product of those government-subsidized crops. Every one of these additives serves the same purpose. They make the bread faster to produce, cheaper to manufacture, and longer lasting on the shelf. And the longer a loaf lasts without going stale or moldy, the less a store has to throw away, which means the retail price stays low. But there's a darker side to all this efficiency, because when you strip out the bran and the germ from wheat to make white flour, you're removing the parts that contain most of the fiber, vitamins, and minerals. The bran and germ also contain natural oils that go rancid relatively quickly, which is exactly why manufacturers remove them. White flour can sit in a warehouse for months without spoiling. Whole grain flour can't, so the very thing that makes white bread cheap, the refined flour, is also what makes it nutritionally hollow. And here's the paradox. A bushel of wheat produces about 60 pounds of whole wheat flour, but only about 42 pounds of refined white flour. You literally get less flour from the same amount of grain when you refine it. The whole grain version should logically be cheaper, but it isn't, because whole grain bread rises more slowly, meaning the production line moves slower. It has a shorter shelf life, meaning more waste. And because fewer people buy it, there's less economy of scale to spread the costs. The bread industry figured out a long time ago that volume is everything. White bread sells more units than any other variety. More volume means more efficiency on the production line, bigger bulk purchases of ingredients, and lower cost per loaf. It's a cycle that feeds itself. White bread is cheap because lots of people buy it, and lots of people buy it partly because it's cheap. And the subsidies play into this loop perfectly. The government supports the crops that go into processed food, not the ones that go into your salad. Researchers have pointed out that this system essentially makes unhealthy calories cheaper than healthy ones. $1 buys you a lot more energy from white bread than from fresh vegetables. For families on tight budgets, the math is brutal. The cheapest option and the healthiest option are almost never the same thing. Now let's talk about the other side of the equation, because it explains something people always wonder about. If white bread is this cheap, why is artisan bread so expensive? A small bakery buys flour in 25 or 50 pound bags. A factory buys it by the ton. A small bakery employs skilled bakers who work through the night. A factory uses machines that run 24 hours with minimal labour. A small bakery makes a few hundred loaves a day. A factory can produce millions. Then there's the fermentation. Real sourdough, for example, needs time. Sometimes 12, 24, even 48 hours of slow fermentation. That time costs money, in labour, in space, in energy. The Chorleywood process eliminated almost all of that weight. And here's the trade-off that nobody in the industry likes to talk about. That slow fermentation isn't just about tradition. It develops complex flavours, breaks down compounds that can cause digestive issues, and creates a bread with a fundamentally different texture and shelf character. When you skip that step, you get a softer, blander, puffier loaf that needs additives to mimic what time used to provide for free. So the real question isn't why is white bread so cheap? It's why we've built an entire food system around making it that way. The story of white bread is really a story about choices made at every level. Governments chose to subsidize wheat and corn over fruits and vegetables. Scientists chose to prioritize speed and volume over nutrition and flavor. Manufacturers chose to add chemicals rather than wait for dough to develop naturally. And consumers chose convenience and price over everything else. None of those choices happened in a vacuum. During the Depression and World War II, cheap bread was a necessity. When Wonder Bread launched in 1921 and became one of the first brands to sell sliced bread nationwide by 1930, it represented genuine progress. Families could afford to eat. Sliced bread was so beloved that when the government briefly banned pre-slicing during World War II to conserve resources, the public backlash was so intense that the ban was reversed within 2 months. But what started as a solution to hunger became something different. By the 1950s and 60s, Wonder Bread was running ads claiming it helped build strong bodies in 12 ways, referencing its added vitamins and minerals. The Federal Trade Commission eventually went after them for deceptive advertising, arguing that Wonder Bread's nutrients were no different from any other enriched white bread on the market. The message was clear: the industry wasn't selling nutrition, it was selling an idea. And that idea persists today. White bread remains the most popular bread in America. It's in every school cafeteria, every hospital, every prison, every convenience store. Not because it's the best bread, not because it's the healthiest, but because the entire system, from farm subsidies to factory engineering to retail pricing, has been designed to make it the cheapest option on the shelf. The next time you're in the grocery store, do this. Pick up the cheapest loaf of white bread you can find. Then pick up a loaf of whole grain bread from a local bakery. Feel the difference in weight. Read the ingredient lists. One has 4 or 5 things you recognize. The other reads like a chemistry textbook. Then look at the prices and ask yourself which one is really the better deal. I'm curious what you think. Is cheap white bread a triumph of food engineering or a failure of our food system? Drop your take in the comments. If you found this interesting, the video on screen right now goes even deeper into how the food industry keeps costs low. Click it.